Mark Drewell is someone that I've known, I guess really since almost the beginning of my time here. I've been here now 2 years. Mark is someone who has a long-standing relationship with Iflas and with Professor Jem Bendel, and he sits on our advisory board. But when I met him, he was living in Devon, and I have a connection with Devon too, so we kind of bonded there, but working out of Brussels with the Global Responsible Leaders Initiative, the GRLI. And he then recently, over the last 18 months, has been working for the Foresight Group out of Sweden. And I'm going to let him tell you more about that, because he's very much an entrepreneur in the movement of business for the better, for the common good, for the common good of society. And he's certainly grappling with those sorts of issues with business leaders and companies in his current work. So I'm going to let Mark tell you more about that. Mark is not going to use PowerPoint. He's going to give us a good old-fashioned talk. And he's certainly open for you to ask questions and engage as we go along. And we're going to roughly go for an hour before opening up for a wider Q&A, but I think Mark is certainly open to having you engage as we go along. So over to you, Mark.
Thank you.
How are you all doing? How's everybody? Tired? All right.
They're just going to sign their group project.
And that's the people who are not on the MBA program, right? Yeah, thank you. It's great. Thanks, David. It's great to be here. First of all, a bit of a sound check. Can everyone hear me? I'm not using a microphone. This one is for the recording. Okay, that's cool. That's a good start. It's a great pleasure to be here, particularly because, as David said, I live in Devon, and it's fantastic being in the only county in Britain which is even wetter than the one that I live in. So, and today it's proving it. I thought that it would be useful to explore three things during the time that we have together. And the first one was to talk about and explore the context that we're in. The second one was to look at the question of responsible leadership and what that is all about and the lenses that I can share with you on that. And then the third one was to look at some sort of practical ideas about what do you actually do if you are trying to change the way things work, and how does one make that function in a way that increases the probability of success. But before I do that, perhaps just a little bit of my background, because, you know, here's another guy standing in front of you. Okay, he's got a piece of bullshit written on a card that says what he is and where he's come from. But I thought it might be useful to share a little bit of my own journey, because I hope that it's relevant to what we're going to talk about. Because I grew up in the southwest of England, and I was educated in the traditional English way, and I went off to university and I studied some politics and some philosophy and some economics. I then headed off and spent 5 years in the City of London as investment analyst, mostly because I couldn't think of anything better to do at the time. And I found myself working for a mining company, and as a result of that, and I was doing the analytics of investing in mining businesses around the world, I said to the people, well, this is great, but I don't know anything about mining. So they said to me, well, we can send you off on a secondment. And they said, you can go to Africa or Australia. And I said, well, I had a gap year in Australia. I've never been to Africa. Let's go there. So they said, great. And they sent me off to South Africa. And this was in 86, 87. Now, for those of you whose history can remember that kind of time, this was the height of apartheid. And I found myself landing in this country. I spent 10 months there trying to figure out what on earth was going on, trying to learn about the mining business, and suddenly being immersed in this extraordinary maelstrom of political change. But much more importantly, and this is the real stories of life, is that while I was there, I met a girl and I fell in love. And so 2 years later, I went back there to get married and to do what many people from this part of the world do, and just go out and spend a few years somewhere else in the world with the ambition one day I would come home, maybe a few years later. In fact, it turned out to be 20 years later. And interestingly, I didn't marry that person. In fact, if we had been in the same city when we got engaged, Actually, we never would have got engaged, but that's another story. I did marry somebody else in South Africa, and so I have a wife and 4 children who are all kind of carry South African passports, Dutch passports, British passports. They're really confused about who they are in the world, but that's part of the world that we live in. I work for a consulting firm based in Stockholm. I live in Devon. We have clients all over the world. So while I was in South Africa, I found myself in the middle of this is 1989. Nelson Mandela had not been released. Is anyone here from South Africa, by the way? Close. How close? Zambia. Okay. From South Africa. From Joburg. And Mozambique. There's a hand there as well, was that? Also South Africa. Okay. So for people who come from that part of the world, part of this story won't sound strange, but for the rest of us, it might sound a little unusual. So I was working in a steel company in the middle of this time of mass protest, and we had to sell steel to the Japanese, and if we didn't make it, for any reason, they would stop buying from us and they wouldn't come back. So we had this hidden deal with the ANC and its trade union leadership in our organization, which was essentially we would do lots of things to break the law in terms of the advancement of black employees, and they wouldn't go on strike. And this was kind of a social contract that we had under the radar, so we did all sorts of things that at the time were illegal but now make perfect sense, and to us made perfect sense then. But eventually the wave of political action caught up with us, and we ended up in this situation where the community in this town of Middelburg were refusing to pay for their electricity, the power had been cut, people were stopped from going to work, and within 3 days we had 3 people killed through having a tire put on them and set alight. So it was a very, very messy situation. And 3 of us as young managers at the age of 27, I was 27, the oldest one of the 3 of us was 29. We looked at each other and said, we should try and do something about this. So we got hold of the head of the trade union, and we said, listen, I don't know, but do you think you could get the guys who are the angry youths in the townships to come and have a conversation with us to see if we can figure this out? And the trade union head said, yes, we can. And we went along to the town councillors who were responsible for turning off the lights and the water into the town because of the unpaid bills. We said, would you come and talk to us to see if we can get some discussion going to break this deadlock? And they all said yes. So they came into this business, this steel plant, and they walked into the room and they looked at each other and they turned around and walked out again. And we sort of said to them, well, hang on, look, can you at least stay on the site? So one bunch went and sat in one building, another bunch sat in the other building. And we started this shuttle diplomacy between them. And some say, this started at like lunchtime. About 5 o'clock in the afternoon, we realized that something was possible here. Because everybody could agree on one thing, which is that everybody wanted this community somehow to move forward. Create a better community for everybody. So we suddenly had a brainwave. I don't remember, it doesn't really matter which one of us had it. And we said, how big is the backlog? And the answer was, at the time, in money of the time, about 300,000 American dollars, which was a lot of money, of an electricity bill that was unpaid by the community. So we went along and we picked up the phone to the chief executive in Johannesburg, 100 miles away. And we said to him, we've got this idea, would you be willing to settle the bill, the backlog? And he said, well, why would I do that? And he said, well, because people have agreed that if we settle this bill, they will at least sit in the same room and talk. He said, will that call off the strike? We said, well, we don't know, but we think it's worth a try. So when he'd finished laughing and then swearing at us, he said, this is so insane. He picked up the phone to the chairman of the company. Chairman of the company, who was a much more, shall we say, visceral human being, used words of one syllable that my children definitely should not hear for many years to come, when he was told of this idea. And in the end, he said, yes, okay, let's do it. So late in the afternoon, the finance director was writing out a check for $300,000, or the Rand equivalent. And we started this diplomacy saying, if you guys just agree to talk, this money can settle this deal tonight. And eventually, at about 2 o'clock in the morning, I think everyone was just exhausted, they said, okay, all right, we agree. We will come back tomorrow to meet. And the 3 of us set off in my colleague Chris's car, and we went and knocked on the town engineer's door in the middle of the night. He was a bit surprised. It was well below freezing, and this man sort of came out in his dressing gown, and he looked at us, and we gave him this check, and he looked very surprised. And we said, well, that's the backlog. And he said, okay. And he phoned up the technicians and said, put the lights back on. And we went up onto the top of the hill and looked down over this town of 70,000 people that had no electricity in the dead of night. And the power came back on. And you could hear people cheering. And we started this community forum. And we got everybody involved. We got the community, we got the town council, we got the stooge illegitimate government, we got the ANC activists underground, the angry youths from the township, the churches, everyone got involved. And it was going really well because we agreed that we could all talk about one thing, which was creating a better community for all of us. And while we were doing this one day, there was a knock on the door about 2 months later, and in through the door walked a phalanx of very big men in dark suits. And in the middle of them was a little guy wearing a purple dress, and it was Desmond Tutu. And we didn't know he was coming. So he walks in. Now, half the room thinks this guy is the devil incarnate, the turbulent priest. The other half of the room think he's a hero. But he carried enormous charisma, and my friend Chris, who was chairing the meeting, sort of stepped back, and Tutu said, don't mind me, sit down. And he said, carry on, and he sat in the corner over there, and after about an hour, he put his hand up, and he said, do you mind if I say something? He said, I'd like to say a prayer. And South Africa is a very religious country, and everybody joined him in prayer. And afterwards he said, thank you, I'm going to go and talk to some friends in Johannesburg. And what we didn't know was that the chairman of this company of ours was also the chairman of the National Chamber of Business. And he was a great friend of Desmond Tutu's. And he had picked up the phone when he heard what we were doing and saw this committee starting to work. And he said to him, listen, you go down and have a look at what my guys are doing down in Middelburg, and let's have a chat about it afterwards. So they got together in Johannesburg, and they created, and they talked about it. And this guy, John Hall, said, you know what? I can get the business people in every community in the country together. And Desmond Tutu said, well, I can get the church groups. They said, let's do more of these. And in the end, they created 4,000 of these community initiatives. And it became the thing called the peace committees, which in the end became the power broker for the whole political transition. And the reason that I tell you this story, apart from the fact it's a nice, memorable story, is that none of us who were initiating that little idea to solve a problem had any idea about the consequences that it could unroll. And all sorts of people on that journey, from 3 people sitting around saying, we've got to try and figure out and take some action here, all sorts of people stepped in to support that process of doing something which turned out to be important. And the difference between the people who stepped forward, and I've thought about this over the years, because many thousands of people stepped forward in that time in South Africa, and many thousands did not. And the fundamental difference between them is something about the internal value system and compass that they carry. That compass that says, I see something and I'm going to do something about it. Not because I have an answer, but just because I see that something needs to be done here. And in my life, that changed my own perspective as a 27-year-old about what business can do. So I spent many years in the corporate world. I spent a decade as a sort of head of corporate affairs of a company with 35,000 people in 32 countries and $6 billion of turnover. Being a change agent trying to improve things, driving sustainability into the business, trying to persuade the investment community the logic of what we did as a business, reforming the brands, and a dozen different things across all sorts of businesses. And when I turned 40, I told all my mates that when I was 45, I would leave corporate life. And I told my mates so I would be publicly humiliated if I didn't. Because I knew that if somebody couldn't hold me to account, that wouldn't happen. And I did, and I left Johannesburg, went down to Cape Town, did the kind of things that you always dream about. I built a distillery and started an investment management company with a deep sustainability focus. But I stayed involved in this initiative about responsible leadership this thing that David mentioned, which has grown to 100 companies and business schools around the world, wrestling with the question, how do we create a new generation of responsible leaders? And somewhere along that journey in 2008, the board said to me, why don't you come and run this firm, this initiative? I said, no. They kept asking me. 6 months later, I came back from a meeting in Bordeaux. And for those of you who have life partners, you'll know this kind of story, this conversation. It went like this. I walked in to see my wife. I said, we need to talk. She looked at me and said, where are we going? I said, how does Brussels sound? She said, thank God it's not England. Which is, of course, I was joking and say the reason she said thank God it wasn't England is because she thinks that most people in England are as dysfunctional in their relationship to changing the world as most of my old university mates are. She subsequently discovered there were lots of people in England who actually have a desire to see the world be a different place. But her first reaction was, thank God it's not England. So we moved to Brussels, and I spent 5 years running this global organization and being incredibly involved in trying to figure out how we transform business education, what works, what doesn't, and we could spend hours talking about that. And then subsequently, I find myself now as a partner in a Stockholm-based advisory firm with 20 people who basically spend our time helping organizations that have an ambition to do something significant that's relevant to the times we live in. If you'd met this firm, Foresight, 10 years ago, they would have been all about helping. Are you familiar with the life cycle curve of companies? You know, from birth through success and then decline. We're all doing MBAs, so you should be nodding furiously, or at least if it isn't, it's coming in a module near you. It's in strategy. So the life cycle curve. So this company used to spend its time, I'm drawing this backwards, so it'll be interesting to see if it works, saying to companies as they stood at the top of the pinnacle of their success, mostly in Sweden and the States, and looking down into the abyss and trying to figure out what they were going to do, we can help you to create a small company spirit in your organization. Because we know more about entrepreneurship, the process of creating entrepreneurial change in large organizations, than anyone else in the world. So for 20 years, they did that. They did that to help companies become more profitable. And about 10 years ago, they started thinking a bit more deeply about this, and they said, hang on, actually, this stuff is really relevant to the bigger challenges of the times we live in. And started doing work around the world with organizations who had an ambition to create something new that was really relevant to the times we live in. So I sketch all of that because my life for the last 20 years has been a combination of the world of large institutions, the world of business, and the world of trying to figure out what it is that's going on and how do we fix it. And I say what it is that's going on because that brings me neatly to the first part of these three pieces. And this is the context that we're in right now. And the context, for me, I'm going to talk about it because even if we can't get on the same page, I'd like you at least to know what page I'm on when I'm talking about the next remarks. And I've spent the last 2 years going around and talking to leaders all over the world and saying to them, where do you think we are? You know, what's going on? When you look at your own organization, when you look at the society in which you live. And I've done that in Africa, I've done it across Europe, I've done it in the States, a little bit in Asia, not so much. I get basically the same answer. When you look people in the eye and you say, what do you really think is going on? The executive summary I get is that the system is broken. The system is broken. People have lots of different explanations of why and how, but it's fascinating at a gut level, that sense that the logic of the system in which we function as leaders is broken, I find is almost universal. And that's different. It's very different to how it was 10 years ago. Because I used to do a lot of work 10 years ago teaching people about sustainability. And I'd walk into a room and I'd say something like, in the next half hour, I'm going to talk to you about why I think the system is broken. And half the room would kind of go, oh God, what's this rubbish? Especially if they were bright people and especially if they were engineers. And if they were finance people, they were even further onto that. I'm just trying to see who else I can insult. Marketers, the whole lot, doesn't matter. That 10 years ago, half the room didn't have that feeling. Now, and interestingly, particularly at senior leadership levels, people really get this gut sense that we live in a system that's broken. And so I got to think about, how do I understand that? And you can spend a lot of time picking on the individual pieces of the story. You can look at issues around climate change. You can look at and issues about nature, about the fact that we're destroying species at 1,000 times the background rate. You can look at the Stockholm Centre for Resilience with its 9 measures of the extent to which the natural world can support human life. And you read that, that 3 of them we've already passed that point, and 5 of the other 6 are threatened. The only one which we've actually successfully dealt with is the ozone layer, interestingly enough. And of the 3 that we've passed, the latest one is climate change. It's not the original one. So the poster child of our global conversation is actually 3rd on this list of things that that we struggle with. And then you can go from the natural world, you can go down the road to the world of social science, and the kind of body of evidence about the way in which our economic system is not serving the common good, the way in which we're not creating the capacity for the extraordinary wealth that we've created to trickle down and uplift everybody. You can see all of that information. It's all kind of there. But what I realized was, in fact, the best way for me to understand it is with the idea of narratives, of stories. And the way I frame it, and the way it makes sense to me, is to understand that we lived in a time through broadly the whole period from the Second World War to the end of the 20th century, where the narrative, the story that we all lived in, gradually coalesced towards a single idea. And that single idea was that the game was economic growth. The game was economic growth, and the subtext was that perpetual growth was both a good thing and possible. Now, narratives are really interesting. Imagine you were in ancient Rome at the time, sort of the year 0. The narrative then was a narrative of multiple gods. It was a narrative of the Roman games, Pax Romana, the expansion of the empire, slavery, a whole bunch of things that were perfectly normal. In fact, that narrative continued for at least 300 years. It was very, very established. And if you were a leader in that time, when you were in this fixed narrative, the issues you confronted were essentially about optimizing what already existed. That was the name of the game as a leader. Now wind forward a bit and go forward to, say, the 1700s in Europe, where on the one side you had the establishment, and that was about the divine right of kings, about feudal lords, about serfs, about duty, about being born into the place you were always born into. But then over here, you had the Enlightenment coming at you. You had people manufacturing. You had people translating the Bible into the languages that local people could read. Suddenly, the whole game was changing. And you had this collision of 2 narratives, the future and the past. And the past was the establishment. And I would suggest to you that we are in a time that's very similar to that picture of 2 narratives colliding. Because on the one side, you have the narrative that we all grew up in, which was that essentially it's about growth and it's about expanding and distributing more effectively the successes of expanding the economic system. Premised on the idea, when you investigate it a little bit more deeply, that in fact, if you grow the system, what you do is you make people happier, because more wealth is a good thing. Not only for those who have nothing, the 6, soon to be 7 of the 8 billion people on this earth who don't have a kind of level of basic services that the billion of us enjoy, but that for that billion, the people who do have the wealth, the assumption was still the same, that in fact more economic growth, the ability to buy more stuff, was inherently a worthy goal. And of course, the interesting thing is that if you wander down the road from a faculty of business or economics to a faculty of social sciences, what you will discover is when you describe the characteristics of this part of the narrative, perpetual growth, if you like, shopping makes us happy. This idea, what your social science friends will tell you is it's a pathological behavior. Because what they will tell you is that in all the social research that's ever been done, there is no finite point beyond which you become fully happy. What happens is, once your basic needs are met, essentially what happens is you start referencing yourself relative to your neighbors. So you're trapped in this crazy cycle where the only time you feel happy is if you've got more wealth than the person who's sitting next to you. And of course, if they're in that cycle, it's essentially a pathological behavior, because growing the system cannot achieve the kind of ambition that you set out for in the first place, which was to make, was to improve things. So that's the kind of dilemma of the old narrative. But the new narrative that's unfolding all around us is a different narrative. It's a narrative that says, actually, the job of the system which we operate is about well-being. It is about creating a framework within which the deeper reasons why people can be satisfied in life are met. And I'll give you the 6 core ones, because this is quite fascinating. This is another piece of social science research. There's a paper here, by the way, and all this is referenced, so we'll be showing it, yeah. So you can get all of this stuff. But so there are 6 things that all human beings kind of look for. First one is love. Love is about the quality of our personal relationships. The second one is being in community, being connected to some community that is bigger than ourselves. The third one is doing meaningful work, doing something meaningful in our daily work, whatever that word work means. The fourth one is learning for the joy of knowledge, not necessarily to make me a better unit of labor, but learning. The fifth one is service to others. It's the act of serving other people. And then finally, the sixth one is the quality of our connectedness to nature. Quality of our connectedness to nature. And we have done a whole load of work in the Foresight Group in partnership with a firm called Quattroporte in Sweden. And let me tell you about Quattroporte before I tell you about the work we've done. Quattroporte is a firm that spends its time matching big data information with the normal qualitative analysis of trends. Big data and qualitative analysis of trends. What usually happens in the world is you have people who understand big data, but usually they're young. Their ability to actually work with that sensing of what's going on in the world is limited. So they put these two ideas together. And they're really, really good at spotting trends. Often that doesn't make them very popular because they'll walk into their clients, a large supermarket, and tell them that everything that's in the strategy of this client is complete rubbish. Because although they think it makes sense, when they look at the big data and match it with what they're seeing, they discover it's actually not coherent with the trends that are really going on. And what we've figured out in the last, I suppose, basically 6 months of continual conversations is that we thought that it was something about, there are all these phrases hurtling around about the circular economy, about issues of well-being, about there's mindfulness, there's a whole raft of kind of activities. There's the organic food movement, this raft of things going on in the world. And basically what we've finally figured out is if you like, a framework within which all of this fits, that I would suggest to you is the defining framework of the way the world of business is moving in the 21st century. And this is the idea of what we've called the meaningful economy. And it's about, essentially, this idea of the economic system reorientating itself not towards an agenda of perpetual growth, but towards an agenda of matching these kind of 6 fundamental human needs. This idea of love and community and knowledge and being connected to nature, serving others, and so on. So I have to say this is the first time that we've actually shared this outside of our own internal knowledge. So if in 3 years' time the meaningful economy is all over the place, you will know that here in Cumbria you heard it first in a public domain. The interesting thing about it is that all of these various kind of pieces in the puzzle, the shift towards making manufacturing closed loop. Are people familiar with the notion of the circular economy, of closed loop supply chains? Basic, simple, some are nodding, some are not. So short summary, essentially the 20th century logic of manufacturing was you took natural resources, you made something, and you threw away. Either both the waste from making it and eventually the product itself. The closed loop circular economy argument says that every output is an input into something else. So you're trying to massively reduce resource consumption by reusing, recycling, re-engineering, and creating a circular effect. So you're essentially moving more towards the logic of mimicking nature. So there's this whole raft of things going on that are coherent with this idea that we're shifting towards something that's not about simply doing more stuff. It's about creating a meaningful economy. And that's very exciting, but it's also really challenging if you are a leader. And it's particularly challenging because I would suggest to you that very, very few organizations of any kind, public sector, private sector, NGOs, are genuinely fit for purpose for the times that we're moving into. And I've just, the week before last, I was in Cambridgeshire for 3 days of working with a group of 68 people who come from 30 of the UK's largest organisations. So from the civil service to the Bank of England to a whole bunch of financial service, professional services firms, to manufacturing companies. And these people all expect within the next 10 years to be on the central executive team of their organisation. So they've been handpicked because, in theory, they're the fast trackers. Not because they care, not because they're interested in what's going on in the world, but because they are, in the traditional mode, expected to be the people who will take the organisation forward. And what's fascinating is after working with them now for 4 days, 3 days in one residential, and then after the first day of this second residential, it became really clear that this idea that their organizations are profoundly not fit for purpose was universally felt. Universally felt. If we'd asked that question, we did ask that question at the beginning of the first day of sort of 4 days previously, which was back in October last year, most people in the room felt that there were kind of a few issues, but basically things were fine. And as they started to wrestle more deeply with the questions of where is the world going, this realization that their own organizations were not fit for purpose was really challenging them. What's also interesting is that the very reason they were in that room was because over the last 3 years, the team that put together that initiative, which is called the Forward Institute, had gone to the chief executives and chairmen of all of these organizations and said to them, we don't think your leaders are able to help your organizations to be successful in the period when they will be in charge, 10 years out, 5 years out even, for 2 reasons. And the reasons are that, first of all, this fundamental point that the entire logic of the system is changing. And secondly, because the people you promote into positions of leadership typically have 2 characteristics. One is that they are really good at optimizing what exists inside the company. And 2, the second thing is that they are really good at their internal networks and the culture of the organization as it exists today. That's what it takes to get to the top. And what's interesting is that in every single one of these cases, CEOs and chairmen of the companies all go, yes, you're right. The liberating thing is we're also saying to them, and by the way, we're not expecting you to change because you don't have those skills either. And you watch their body language, they go, thank God. Because one of the eternal truths of leadership is that even the most narcissistic, egotistical leaders I know, somewhere inside them there's a little person speaking that says, really? Me? Am I doing this job? I'm not, I'm actually this just like everybody else. And that's so when you ask people who've reached the pinnacle in any organization, in business, in politics, to be the leaders of change, a piece inside them says, I can't do that. I don't know how to do that. That's not what I was hired for. I was hired because I know how it works now, not because I know how it's going to work in the future. And so this is a really important piece about the nature of being, we talk about responsible leadership, because obviously the agenda that we talk about is the idea of creating the kind of change that's going to make a positive contribution in the world. But what's interesting is that when you sit face to face with someone who's in a senior leadership role and really discuss this question about their own sense of if they were about to get their own job, would they be able to make the organization be successful? Even at the level of being successful, let alone the level of being a contributor to society, part of them recognizes that that's something that they don't have. So that brings me very neatly to the question of, so what does that mean for leadership? And I'd like to kind of briefly sort of contrast the, if you like, the logic of what happens when you're in a narrative that is reasonably stable, in a time when fundamentally, yes, there may be technological innovation in sectors, but broadly the rules are not changing. The game is about optimization. So you need to be a really good manager of processes. You need to be really good at optimizing what exists. And in a political context, you need to be really good at lobbying for self-interest, because someone else has written the rules. So your job is to optimize your individual organization's success within the context of the system that's already established. If, however, you are living in the times that we live in today, in which the entire system is in some kind of transition, there are three other characteristics that you really need. And the first one is the notion of entrepreneurship. Because if we are right in what we're saying, that no organization is genuinely fit for purpose, then it's definitional that your job as the leader is to transform it profoundly, not incrementally. And in the final piece of this, I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. So entrepreneurship, again, which is absolutely not a characteristic that people who rise to the top of organizations are generally blessed with, other than those that create them. The second one is the notion of values-driven leadership. Values-driven leadership. And the important thing about this is that in a narrative that's fixed, in a very real sense, the values are determined by the society around you, and they're fixed, okay? So they get translated into laws, they get translated into custom and practice, and as long as I understand that system, then I know I'm doing the right thing. The problem about a world in transition is that the signposts are all gone. And for example, just when you think you understand what's required of you in terms of disclosing your tax returns, the world suddenly tells you it's not good enough. So the essence of values-driven leadership in the context of this kind of world in which everything is changing is the challenge to be constantly questioning and interrogating the values. Not just having a good set, but working with them and asking, well, what does it mean? And, if you were David Cameron 6 months ago, you would have assumed that being squeaky clean about filing your tax returns was actually the right thing. And suddenly you're finding it's something else. So there's this really interesting challenge about values-driven leadership. So that's the values-driven bit. But the other part is the leadership bit. And what specifically leadership in this context, I would suggest, means is the challenge of figuring out what is really going on, if you like, sense making. Because it's very easy to spend your time concentrating on, if you like, the assumption that the world hasn't changed. So typically that's the game of, well, okay, we've got to make sure that we increase our market share by 3%, and yeah, we need to just benchmark our salaries against everybody else's. But sense-making would say, hang on, actually, this entire logic of our manufacturing system is not circular. And we need to figure out what to do about that, because that's coming towards us. It's a small trend now, but in 5 years' time, it's going to be central to our success. Let's talk about the workplace. We actually still have an underlying attitude that says people are lucky to get a job in our organization. Now, that's a value system that many established organizations live with. Why? Because most people who run them grew up in a time when that was true. And the value system of the next generation is saying, hang on, I actually want some work-life balance. I want the choices. I want the time, be able to spend time with my children. So the sense making suddenly says, hang on, salaries and the way we employ people is not simply about, are we benchmarking our salaries effectively? So that's the second piece. So you've got this notion of entrepreneurship, and the second piece, which is about values, values-driven leadership. Then the third piece is this idea of statesmanship. And statesmanship is a recognition that if you are in a world that's in transition, your responsibility as a leader, no matter what organization you are leading, is to participate in the journey of transforming the entire system. And again, this is not a skill set that most people who run organizations today have developed. In the South African context, lots of people learned it really quickly. And they learned it because they went through a period where the only thing that was clear was that no country on earth had ever made a successful transition from a minority to a majority political control. No one had ever done that. So the only thing you knew with certainty was that the entire system on which your business was functioning was doomed to fail, based on the evidence. So a lot of people learned the notion of statesmanship, trying to figure out how I can be a role player in the wider system. But again, this is another dimension of leadership that's absolutely not part of what we're all taught to do when we go to business school, or at least historically we weren't. So I'm going to shift now just briefly to the final part of what I want to talk about, and that is to reflect on the question of how are we doing as business people in creating change, the kind of change that perhaps this transition in narratives and the challenge of leadership is asking us to do. And I guess, again, the executive summary is, as established organizations, we're doing really badly. And we're doing really badly for if you like, an inbuilt reason in the logic of the system. And it goes like this. Most people think that successful businesses are successful because, or any organization, political, NGO, doesn't matter, are successful because they're inherently clever. Our work in Foresight of 35 years of trying to understand what makes a business successful tells us that fundamentally, institutions, organizations that are successful because they found something that works and they don't mess it up. And the entire logic of institutions is you build systems and structures to ensure that the people who work in your organization carry on doing exactly what they did yesterday and the day before and the day before. It's about 99% of the game is about making sure that business as usual stays very usual. The last thing you want is the airline pilots to wonder what it's like to fly upside down tomorrow morning when they're flying 50 passengers from London to Glasgow. You don't want innovation in most of what you do. And if you look at what entrepreneurs do to create a successful business, the way that a business goes from being a startup to becoming successful is figuring out what works and then doing more of that. And it's not very helpful, I would suggest, to have the heroic view of institutions that they're successful because they're clever. They're successful because they do stuff that works. Now what that means is that they build entire logics, entire systems, which are designed to keep the organization doing what it does. And then they adjust on the margins. And they have planning cycles that are designed to ensure that that is maintained. If it's important, it's called strategic planning. Most people end up calling everything strategic planning. But that game is all about, we have all these resources over here. We have a really good defined goal over there. And we optimize and we measure and we test and we regulate and we make sure that everything is performing as we expect as we move through the cycle of the year and the cycle of implementing new projects. And fundamentally, it is all incremental. And it needs to be, because if it's not, you run the risk that this core thing that you've created will stop working. The problem with that is when you start moving into a world where everything is up for grabs and changing, you have to do something else. You have to create profound change. You have to go back to the logic which probably got you successful originally, which was to try a lot of radically different stuff. And what happens in large organizations is that those kind of initiatives end up being treated like a virus. And the white blood cells, if you like, of process and structure come in. I mean, I don't know how many people have been really successful at creating profound change in a large organization. No. And in fact, it's very, very rare. And there's this technical structural reason, and that is because of the way in which successful organizations build themselves. And often we blame, oh, it's Fred, or it's Jane, or it's the leader, or it's the accounts department, or whatever it is, the planning cycle. The point is that they are hardwired to be difficult to change. So this is the first of 4 principles that I'd like to invite you to sort of think about. And I'm not going to give you examples of each one. And there's a very good reason for that. And the reason is that what happens in examples is that we get wrapped up in the detailed execution of what a particular organization does. And the reality of the 3 principles that I'm now going to share with you, in addition to this first one, that there's this big difference between, if you like, an institutional mindset and an entrepreneurial one, the reality of the difference is that the application of these principles is always customized and unique. And I mean, I spent half my life being really excited by what someone else had done in another organization, marching back into my own organization and then trying to make it happen, and then failing. You know, so why is that? And then what I realized in recent years is that the point is that it's the unique cocktail of these things, of these applying these principles, that allows you to create significant change. So the first principle, and this, I say, is all written up in here, but I'm just sort of giving you a little sketch of it. The first principle that's really important is the principle of opportunity selection. So you want to change something, and the principle of opportunity selection says, have a really clear picture of roughly what it is you want to change. Roughly what it is. And then related to that, have a clear understanding of the parameters within which you can operate, in the sense of, what is it around here that is going to enable me to achieve change? In some organizations, it might be, whatever I do has got to be profitable in a short period of time. In other organizations, it might be, I can only mess with the client base that we already have, or the opposite, you know, some set of parameters. And then related to that, what are the kind of the geographies, or the areas in which there are genuine opportunities to create something? Is it in manufacturing? Is it in a particular part of the world? Is it in the way in which we employ people? Whatever. So the whole point about opportunity selection is the idea that success in creating profound change starts with narrowing down the options to something that is workable with. Now that's very different from defining the goal. The goal can still stay very, very fuzzy. In fact, it should be. And the reason that the goal should stay fuzzy is because the truth about anything that ultimately works is that it was never what you originally started out to do. And every entrepreneur who creates anything will tell you that that is their experience. They had an idea, they set out, by the time they got there, they were actually doing something completely different. So opportunity selection. The second one is, again, and these are not rocket science, but people very rarely apply them all together. The second one is the principle of first who, then what. Now, if anyone has read Jim Collins' work on Good to Great, has anyone read the book Good to Great, Jim Collins? Yep. You'll recognize the phrase because Jim Collins uses it. And he uses it in a slightly different way, but it's just a minor aside. Jim Collins, as a young researcher, shared an office with the Foresight founders in Washington. So there was a lot of kind of conversations and crossover. But the concept of first who, then what is something that organizations almost routinely forget. They have a brilliant idea of something they want to change, and then they just appoint somebody. So they say, congratulations, you're now the person who's now going to go and do that. Now what they don't know is that you're about, well, not you, but your wife's about to have a baby. You just moved house, your mother's sick. And like a good corporate soldier, you'll say, yeah, okay, I'll do it. But actually, 3 months later, you come back with all sorts of really good evidence as to why that change can't work. Because the reality is you were not self-selecting. You were not the person who was actually going to climb over the mountains to go and make that work, because you were not passionate about it. So first who then what says, find the people who are passionate. But of its own, that's not good enough. The second thing you need is people who have a track record of making change. Now, this is quite controversial, because one of the things that is always taught is the idea that you can learn every skill. Yes, you can learn most skills. But our experience tells us that the people who are most likely to succeed are people who have a track record of creating new stuff. Now, usually that may not be in the workplace, because institutions are really bad at finding people who create change. But often you'll find that there's actually somebody who's done fantastic work on the weekends. Developed their local football club or whatever it is. Amazing work in their church or in fundraising or a million different areas. So the second part of the first who then what, if the first one is self-selection, the second one is people who've got a track record. And the third one, and this is all about increasing the probability that you'll succeed. The third one is the idea that somebody has people skills. Because again, one of the mythologies is that entrepreneurs are self-selected heroes who go out there and change the world on their own. And it's complete rubbish. Because when you're trying to create something which inevitably will be different by the time you finish from where you started, you're going to have a lot of people participating and supporting and helping you along the way. So the chances are, if you find someone with people skills, as well as they've volunteered, and the fact that they've got some kind of track record, then that ticks the boxes in terms of the possibility that you've found the right personal people to go on this journey. So there's self-selection. There's the principle of first who, then what. We've talked about opportunity selection. Then the third bit is the basic mechanism of how you create change. And we talked a bit about this logic of how institutions do planning. Align everybody and optimize. Micromanage, plan, check, make sure it's delivered at each key milestone along a journey that you set up at the start, that you check that it's going to plan. Production sites, building sites are very good at this. The entrepreneurial logic says light blue touch paper and stand back. In other words, find the people, give them the goal, and then let them get on with it. And the way that they get on with it is a cycle of learning. For those who are familiar with design thinking, you'll recognize the logic. You have an idea that's up there, a bit of a picture of where you're trying to go, and you try something. We frame it as think big, act small, start now. And the bit that most people forget to do is the start now. They spend a lot of time thinking big and developing the plans, but don't get on with the work. And the reason that's important is because there is no such thing as a bad idea. There is only an untested assumption. And what a lot of people do in leadership positions is they prejudge a good idea and say, no, I don't think that'll work. And in the entrepreneurial cycle, it doesn't matter whether it'll work, because the act of trying it will provide knowledge that will enable you to then trigger something else that might work. So there's a number of features in this. One is this cycle of learning. Do something, test, reflect, figure out whether it was any good. Repeat the cycle. Do, try, test, learn. Do, try, test, learn. So imagine it's loops going up towards a goal. The second part of this is the idea that you should have key milestones. And key milestones is that as you go down this journey, you create deliberately points where you stop and you revisit the goal itself. Because of what I said earlier, the fact is that whatever is one day becomes big, always started small, and fundamentally it was the thing that becomes big is not what was small originally and envisaged. It's a cycle. The goal itself changes, and that's, again, really challenging for an established institution that wants to know the result before they've initiated the program. So that's a really important dimension of this principle of an entrepreneurial learning loop. So very quickly, those sort of three principles are interesting. There's, first of all, understanding the difference before you get to the three principles between the institutional logic and an entrepreneurial logic. The second then is recognizing that it is about having some effective mechanism to create an intent of where you're trying to go, selecting what you're trying to do. It is about finding the right people, and it is about a fundamentally different process of execution than the traditional institutional logic. Now, the important thing about this is it's not rocket scientists. It's not rocket science. But I think it's really important because I've seen it now, sitting with these groups of people who are going to be the leaders of large organizations and watching the way in which the chief executives and chairmen who volunteer their time to come and spend time with these people respond to questions of how to recreate the new. They always do it in this institutional framework. And you can see the kind of energy disappearing out of people as this sort of wallows into a cycle of a feeling that they've got nothing to help. And it does matter because what's at stake really matters, because we are in this extraordinary transition. And I think the good news is that what I notice is with this notion of the emergence of the meaningful economy and the ambition that so many people have to be responsible leaders, to figure out how to make their organizations more successful in the context of the kind of world they'd like to live in. If you match those two things with an understanding of how you create significant change, I think we can really scale and accelerate the impact of the kind of change that's unfolding. And so as a final remark, I'd like to quote something which is the words of Viktor Frankl, who was a Holocaust survivor and psychologist. And in 1977, he wrote a book, a collection of essays called The Unheard Cry for Meaning. And I think that collectively, what we are standing on the edge of is 20 years in which we'll turn the tide on essentially a relatively empty agenda towards one that really is full of meaning, and the meaningful economy will be real in our lives. And Frankl said in 1977, he said, "For too long, we've been dreaming a dream from which we are now waking up. The dream that if we just improve the socioeconomic situation of people, everything will be okay, people will become happy. The truth is that as the struggle for survival subsides, the question has emerged, survival for what? Ever more people today have the means to live, but no meaning to live for." And I think it's really exciting to imagine that we can be the generation that creates an economic system that changes that picture. So thank you.